CJ Stroud speaks, says he wants to dominate. Fantasy experts say not so fast, my friend. Let's go inside the locker room.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the locker room on YouTube. You know what it is. Let's get it. Hey. Locker room. Yeah, we in the locker room. Texas talk. Yeah, you know what we about to do. Localize every angle's what we really do. We the source. We the pulse of the city too. Landlocked. Got the game in the headlock.
Welcome to the locker room, number one source for Texans daily digital content. I'm Landry Locker. You can hear me Monday through Friday, 10 to 2 on Sports Radio 610. We are 16 days away from training camp. Right along with me, I'll be on the field at training camp. We'll have player interviews both on the radio, the Odyssey app. Download the Odyssey app. You can hear me Monday through Friday, 10 to 2, Sports Radio 610. And I'll also probably have some right here, number one source for Texans daily digital content, boots on the ground, best coverage you can get. Speaking of good coverage, Aaron Wilson, he's been all over the place. He was talking to Trent Williams about D'Amico Ryans, and he caught up with CJ Stroud earlier this week. CJ Stroud, quarterback for the Houston Texans, at least we think. Now he's in the competition, the rotation, whatever the hell you want to call it. And he was at Dick's Sporting Goods. He was signing some autographs out there in Katy. Aaron Wilson caught up with CJ Stroud of KPRC2, and CJ Stroud says that he is preparing. There was those videos of him working out with his receivers. CJ Stroud says he is preparing and hoping to dominate with his Texans teammates, his position players.
Definitely just building chemistry, trying to get timing down, trying to be as best as we can so we can training camp and dominate. So that was the goal for that. And we just keep building and have a good offseason.
So there you go. That's CJ Stroud's goals. I don't think anyone has a problem with that. I think everyone should have the goal to dominate. That's what you want to hear. But ESPN, at least their fantasy experts, seem to disagree. And there was a time in this business where fantasy football, and I've been doing this for 15 years, hosting a radio show in some way, shape, or form. There was a time when, fantasy football, you really didn't know how to handle it. It was like, man, do people really care about this? What percentage of your audience cares? Is it relevant? Is it topical? And in the last 15 years, it's a lot like gambling the last few years. You weren't mentioning point spreads and stuff 15 years ago. I'm making it sound like I'm 100 years old, but you really weren't. But when it comes to fantasy football has had a really big hand in increasing the quality of the game. I actually think it makes fans smarter. I know some would argue that it makes them dumber. And I'm sure sometimes when you just look at it from a fantasy perspective, it can blind you. But I think people know the league a lot better now. I think there are some statistics especially with like receivers, running backs, tight ends, where production can be pretty, there is some hidden production, and there is always there's a strong gray area to football, but production can be measured. You have a good idea of who has a decent year. Now, when you get in the trenches, that's when the real experts, the guys, the pro football focused guys, I think that's when they do most of their work. But I do think fantasy football is topical. And let's be honest, probably 99% of my audience plays fantasy football. Now, I only have one team. Some of you have like 20. But the point I'm making is that fantasy football, I think, it's a fun talking point. It's a fun way to discuss the game. And a lot of times it can be, especially with skill position guys, a measurement of success. Not the end all be all, but it is a measurement of success. So let's look at what the 8-man panel. So what happened was ESPN, they have an 8-man panel now that Matthew Berry's gone. And they ranked all of the position groups heading into the offseason. Now they went 25 quarterbacks, 50 running backs, 60 receivers, and then they went 20 at every other position for the most part. And the 8-man panel, they put CJ Stroud outside of the top 25 of quarterbacks. I would say this is fair. Now, we don't know what Bobby Slowick is. We have questions about CJ Stroud's receivers. And quite frankly, the Texans haven't even announced CJ Stroud as a starter. So outside of the top 25 is where CJ Stroud is. There's a chance. Look, we've seen, like, if this were a system that was more clear, then maybe we would have a pretty good grasp of where to go. You see Kirk Cousins and Tua. They were quality fantasy quarterbacks last year, depending on the week. And then you see Jimmy Garoppolo. They win games, and he makes winning plays in this system, but doesn't always correlate to fantasy success. It's not always proportional with fantasy success. So they have CJ Stroud outside of the top 25 of fantasy quarterbacks, but you can dominate in other ways outside of stats. They don't anticipate that. Other QB rankings in the AFC South. They have Trevor Lawrence at number 8. They actually have Anthony Richardson at 17, Bryce Young at 23, and Ryan Tannehill unranked. I look at this list. The Trevor Lawrence is interesting. I actually think Jacksonville might not be as good as a lot of people anticipate them being, but I could see Trevor Lawrence being a much better fantasy quarterback. And sometimes you don't have to be a good team to be a good fantasy quarterback. The Anthony Richardson, I don't think that's a matter of Anthony Richardson being better or worse than CJ Stroud. I think that's just more about surroundings. He has arguably the best receiver in the AFC South, which we'll get into that in a second. He has Jonathan Taylor, and he has a better offensive line, and he has probably a little bit more talent around him. But I don't think that's a matter of that. Bryce Young, we don't know what's going to happen in Carolina, but we know he was QB1, so he's at 23. Ryan Tannehill being unranked is interesting. There's been times where Tannehill's been a quality fantasy quarterback, and there's times where he's been a complete dud. That's hit or miss. A lot of hopes as we continue to talk about ESPN's 8-man panel and what they had the Texans ranked in. Subscribe, like, ride along. Appreciate you for riding along with me. Damien Pierce. A lot of people looking at Damien Pierce and wondering, where's the fantasy value? He's kind of a steal last year. Went undrafted in some leagues. He had a nice run before he got hurt. The Damien Pierce thing is going to be interesting. Now, if you are in H-Town, and I'm in H-Town, and you have Texans fans in your fantasy league, chances are there's not going to be much value with Damien Pierce. He's going to go second or third round, going to go early, and it's probably going to be difficult to get him on your team. But ESPN, their 8-man panel has Damien Pierce number 20 in their fantasy rankings, which I think is about right. 4.5 is the over-under in rushing touchdowns in Las Vegas for Damien Pierce. There's going to be a little bit more of a committee. Devin Singletary is going to do a lot of the work on third down. Also, probably going to get an opportunity to carry the ball a little bit more. They have competence behind Damien Pierce, something they didn't have last year with Rex Burkhead and company. So Damien Pierce at 20 seems about right. I just don't know that there's much value there at this point, especially if you're in a Houston league. Now, I will say this about the AFC South. The AFC South, as bad as questionable and as suspect as the quarterbacks are and as suspect as the wide receivers are, which we'll get to in a sec, the running back rankings are strong. You have 3 in the top 10 in Jonathan Taylor at 4. Know a lot of people probably took him at 1 last year, and you kind of cringe. Derrick Henry at 7. Seems like we've been forecasting his demise for a while. 1,500 yards, 1,200 after contact last year. That hasn't quite happened. Travis Etienne comes in at 10. I'm intrigued to see how he follows up on last season. That's kind of a scary one for me. I guess if you can get him in the late second, I would say go. But I could see him going late first, early second. And then you have Devin Singletary at 42, which I actually think is perhaps the best value. A lot of times when you're in those 3 running back leagues, you're in those 2 running back leagues, a guy that's going to get a few catches a game, 4 or 5 catches a game, can add a lot of value. Devin Singletary could be that. And I could see Devin Singletary getting a much larger chunk of the pie than a lot of people anticipate. I think of all the value, I don't think the value is there for Damien Pierce, although I think Damien Pierce is a beast in the right role. But Devin Singletary might be value. Now, the wide receiver position is interesting. A lot of people anticipate Robert Woods being the Texans' number 1 receiver. Texans are in a weird position when it comes to the wide receiver position, because it's one of those situations, and most of you have done a fantasy draft where you get halfway through your draft and you're saying, okay, I got to predict who the number 1 running back is, who the number 1 quarterback is, who the number 1 receiver is in order to get value in this by this pick. So you're going to be, if you can guess which wide receiver is going to be number one for the Texans, you might be able to get some value a little bit later on, or who you think is going to be the biggest touchdown threat. There's a lot of uncertainty. It could go a number of ways with the Texans, but only one wide receiver is in the top 60 of the ESPN fantasy rankings by their 8-man panel, and that's Nico Collins. Nico Collins comes in at number 53. Robert Woods not ranked. So they, as far as the upside, they like Nico Collins the most. Now, the AFC South, the wide receiver, not great. Not a great wide receiver division. Other wide receiver rankings, they have Michael Pittman Jr. at 26, which I think could be good value, assuming that you're able to get him in the third, fourth round. That could be good value, although we don't know how Anthony Richardson's going to throw and be able to find him. So maybe Indianapolis becomes a run team, could be risky. They like Calvin Ridley more than Christian Kirk, which is interesting. Calvin Ridley, the last time he played a full season, he was one of the most productive fantasy receivers. Disappointed a lot of people after that because he wasn't really on the field. Christian Kirk was a pleasant surprise for Jacksonville last year, but they got Calvin Ridley and Kirk in the same range. It will be interesting to see how Calvin Ridley not only impacts the wide receiver production, but how he impacts the tight end production, which we'll get to in a sec, which the Texans stacked up pretty nicely. And Treylon Burks at 39, it goes back to that Nico Collins discussion where can you find a guy who's going to be the number one guy? And I think Treylon Burks might be kind of an interesting pick, although I could see him on some sleeper lists. And you know how people print out those sleeper lists and go into fantasy drafts, and pretty much everyone has the same sleeper list, so it's not really a sleeper. Dalton Schultz, one of the biggest signings for the Texans the offseason, gave him damn near $10 million. He's been one of the 5 most productive receiving tight ends the last few seasons. He ranks 11th in ESPN tight end rankings. Tight ends are a cluster F in fantasy football. We all know that, but he's the second highest rated AFC South tight end. Tight end is just, it's usually when you go 5 down, you might be able to strike gold a couple of times, but outside of that, a lot of it is similar. But Dalton Schultz comes in at 11. We don't know Bobby Slowick's offense. We do know that Dalton Schultz is very capable as a pass catcher, but 11 seems about right. Other tight end rankings in the AFC South, you got Ingram at 9, which I do wonder if this is going to be an overvalue with Ingram. Ingram did a really good job for Jacksonville last year, signed a contract similar to what Dalton Schultz got. They basically use him as a wide receiver, and a lot of it was touchdown dependent. Only thing is, now you're going to have Calvin Ridley out there. So does Calvin Ridley take away some of the production from Ingram? I think Ingram could be a stretch. I actually think Okongwu could be good value for Tennessee. You never know. But again, it's just kind of that tight end cluster. It's not anything that's going to win you your league or anything like that. But it is good value. Neither Kaimi Fairbairn or the Texans defense ranked in the top 20 of ESPN fantasy rankings. So a little disrespect to D'Amico Ryans. I don't do kicker rankings. I'm usually the just give me a kicker guy. I'm not the first guy in the draft taking the kicker. So I don't have a hot take on that. D'Amico's defense, hopefully it's in the top 20, especially giving in all the investments and how they could use Will Anderson. So CJ Stroud says the Texans are going to dominate. ESPN fantasy rankings, they say otherwise. What say you? Where's the true value for the Houston Texans when it comes to fantasy rankings? CJ Stroud, you taking him in your draft? You can try to sneak him in the last round. Am I sleeping on Damien Pierce? Do you think Devin Singletary could be hidden value? Who's the number one receiver going to be? Dalton Schultz, all that type of stuff. Who knows? All I know is it is lovely that we're 2 weeks and change away from training camp. Ride along with me. I'll be out there. I'll provide you with the best coverage. We started this channel before last season, only getting better, only getting more and more interactive, popular. So subscribe, like, ride along. What Texans are you putting on your fantasy team? Do you like any of them? Where did ESPN screw up, and where did I screw up, most importantly, with my projections? No matter what happens, whether they're right, whether they're wrong, whether the Texans dominate, whether they don't, when it comes to this Texans game inside the locker room. We are all in this together. Go dominate the week, baby.
We really do. We the source. We the pulse of the city too. Landlocked. Got the game in the headlock. Localized.